What is Pantheon Rise of the Fallen missing? The answer is probably a lot, to be completely fair and honest. The game isn't released yet. It's still got a lot of stuff that they need to add. There's races missing, there's classes missing, there's spaces missing. There's just a lot missing. But so what I want to talk about is actually broader topics of things that Pantheon has started and maybe not hit the mark on. Those things that I feel like they're missing. At least in my loud, super obnoxious personal opinion that you can take or leave. First is going to be achievable goals beyond leveling. Pantheon in some ways committed to what I think might have been one of the worst itemization models in MMOs that's covered in a veneer of nostalgia. Classic EverQuest. Now hold on before you bring out the pitchforks, because I'm not talking about EverQuest as a whole. I'm talking about specifically classic EverQuest, the part really before Kunark. Classic EverQuest really defined items not by their goodness or their excitingness, but by their lack of them. You remember Golden Afridi boots and flowing back silk sash not just because they were powerful, but because of the huge gap between getting bronze armor at level 20 and then picking up a flowing black silk sash after hours of farming at level 50. There are differences here, especially early on. EverQuest felt like it had some kind of achievable itemization, like level 1 through 10, for example, working toward getting pieces of patchwork or cloth from vendors felt pretty achievable. Bandit armor was a huge upgrade that you could buy from other players who'd crafted it, and it was also achievable. Then there were just these huge gaps in itemization. I always felt like EverQuest found their itemization in Kunark and Velius. I still remember the absolute joy of finding modest upgrades from Ulthorc in Eastern Wastes or the Rygor camps. Some of it was soloable, some of it you needed a group, but the point was itemization both felt smarter and more plentiful in the second and third expansions of the trilogy of EverQuest that's hailed as the classic era. I think Pantheon right now still lacks that. Outside of grouping, there really isn't much in achievable itemization. Not from vendors, not from enemy drops. They have experimented a little bit with armor drops from orcs that were soloable and groupable, actually making it usable and providing modest gains, and way back early on, crafted armor was pretty damn great before it got kinda nerfed down. But now I think there is just such a huge gap in between gear that it makes progression feel slower than necessary, since both leveling progression and item progression have to work in tandem in a game like this, with one or the other filling gaps between achievements to kind of keep you on that dopamine wheel. That's kind of how these games work. You have to be on this little treadmill of dopamine, and the longer gaps between those little hits of dopamine, while they may make the achievements feel better, and that's kind of something we've wanted from classic MMOs, you do have to have the little tidbits, little snacks in between the meals, or you end up going hungry. I'm not going to sit here and argue for the WoW classic itemization, because that was a flood that made every drop just feel useless. Getting 1 to 2 items per level as you were leveling up just made those items feel not really worthwhile. There was no sense of achievement. I'm kind of arguing for more of a middle ground here. I think it's perfectly valid to go 1 to 5 levels without full-on upgrades, but right now it feels much more sparse than that. Itemization itself feels uneven, even broken, with too much focus on the rare spawn and not enough focus on the marginal upgrade. Even something as simple as gear with marginal stats and slightly different appearances goes a long way, and I'll never argue for all gear to be locked behind group-focused content, even in a group-focused MMO. EverQuest had Batfang earrings and bronze armor and cougar claw earrings from solo mobs for good reason. Not everything needed to come from multi-session dungeon crawling. I hope we also see a better balance between crafting gear and adventure gear in the future too, though that's something that most mmorpgs have struggled with forever. Although I would suggest that a game like EverQuest 2 actually found a pretty decent balance. Now hold on, because I might actually upset you a little bit more here, because I think that these gaps in itemization are actually exacerbated by another decision that Pantheon has made that I think should have been left in the past, and that's the common lands call out and auction system. Now listen, I know that there's a lot of love for this system of just sitting in common lands and calling out and trying to sell things, but there's a cost to doing this, especially as many players have aged out of having time to sit and use auction channels. Inevitably, what this does is it limits the economy of the game to smaller groups of players. Not everything about classic MMOs needs to be exclusionary, and this to me is exclusionary for the sake of exclusion. I know some people will argue that this adds some socializing in the game, but I don't remember a time when I personally, across Ultima Online or EverQuest or all these games that did have this, like, you know, talking to each other to make sales, I don't remember having that as a whole social thing. I remember it being annoying. I don't remember making friends or enemies from asking them if I can buy their Batwing crunchies. I think there's a reason why EverQuest went the Luckland Bazaar route and Ultima Online had NPC vendors and Star Wars Galaxies had NPC vendors pretty fast when they started. In fact, I've actually argued that Pantheon having those kind of NPC vendors or bazaar-like vendors would be a really great middle ground, even if it had to go with the old EverQuest style of having you have to be online to sell things, but using it as a player vendor, and just having places like that where you could have like an actual bazaar zone, I think would be pretty cool middle ground where you're not having to scan through your OOC chat for hours on end. The next thing that I think Pantheon is currently missing is perhaps the largest one for me: lore. The game has slowly started to expand its lore bit by bit, but it's still painfully missing as a key feature. It feels more background and afterthought right now, especially early on, as most of the newer things that have been added for perception are in higher level areas. Perception was supposed to be a defining feature of Pantheon. I've made videos on the importance of perception. So far, it's simply not. In fact, it feels as much of a background thought as it often did in EverQuest, the lore that is, which is counter to what I believe the original design tenets to be for Pantheon. I think part of this comes from this idea that lore doesn't have to be rare. Like it doesn't have to be everything is big global scanning lore. Lore can be as simple as just gleaning more information on the zone and the inhabitants that are there. It doesn't have to be locked behind group quests and group areas. What drew me to Pantheon was the promise of perception more than anything else, and even as things have improved over the last year, it still feels sorely lacking. Perception pings that feed you the game world, even just for flavor, are not there. There are so many ways to do this, and some they haven't experimented with. There are lore pings in different, like in Avelia, that tell you just like, here's a little lore about the city you're in. There's lore pings as you go through the orc tunnels, but then they stop. They're just gone. It's like one of those things where it just feels like there's just not even remotely enough to make the game feel alive. And I understand that not everyone feels the way that I do. I understand that there's a lot of people that don't play MMORPGs for lore or story. They play them for min-maxing, they play them for completely other reasons. But for me, because Pantheon had made perception a core tenet, that's what my expectation is. I have higher expectations for Pantheon than any other game when it comes to perception pings, lore, feeding you information about the game, and visual storytelling than I do for, say, an EverQuest or a Monsters and Memories, because those have not put this as one of their core things. This is where I feel like the game is the most falling flat, at least for me. We need like dozens upon dozens more perception pings, and we needed them like yesterday. Not everything has to result in some kind of new item or some kind of progression like that. Sometimes just the discovery of things in the world and finding out more about the various inhabitants of the game can be worthwhile in its own. It feels so woefully underutilized right now, and honestly, it makes me kind of sad. One suggestion that I've made that I think would be cool in the past is as you explore zones, as you learn more about the game and learn more about the world you are inhabiting, that as you enter new zones, you get little zone summaries that tell you some of the key events that have happened there, some of the things you have discovered through your perception pings. It's just something to add to the world feeling more alive. I think I just often feel like in the MMO space, we've gotten so far away from this idea of world lore actually being important. It got replaced often by single player chosen one stories that supplanted the idea of a world actually mattering, because then it just became your solo story, and all of that like storytelling went into that instead of world storytelling. And then other things started to supplant that, like the need to have the best gear, the need to have the best DPS, the need to have the most, up-to-date raids and everything like that. And it feels like there are so many different games that can do things like that, so many different games that can provide those competitive edges, those different little dopamine hits. It's one of the interesting things for me is that an mmorpg has the ability to create a world that actually matters and has lore to it, one that actually inspired me to write. Without the lore of EverQuest, I would not have become an author. And it makes me sad to think that there might be another person like me out there who might not get that inspiration because so many MMOs have kind of gone away from that visual storytelling, from that world lore. And I kind of thought Pantheon was going to be that MMO to really push it forward as something incredibly important. And so far, it doesn't feel that way. So far, it feels like itemization and challenge and death penalties have all become much more important than the lore. And like I was saying, that makes me sad. But it also might just be me. This next one, though, I think is an interesting one, and it's actually one that there might be fixing, or should be fixing. The homogeny of NPCs. You see, I've come a long way from defending Pantheon's use of elite NPCs like World of Warcraft and Vanguard to feeling it's become far too restrictive, especially with population fluctuations. I've seen just how keenly that divide between group content and solo content has cut the game in half and broken down the ability to go and do things as solo or small groups, or even as poorly optimized groups. This one, though, is on their radar, kind of like the lore is, but with more dedicated plans. They've actually seen how they're going to homogenize NPCs, at least in the early stages. They have a plan to remove elite NPCs in the future and up the difficulty of what are quote-unquote solo NPCs right now. Obviously, what we've seen needs a lot more refinement, but I hope when this does happen, the game as a whole will feel much more open and accessible than it does currently to the players of all styles, hardcore and not. Basically going away from this World of Warcraft idea of NPC difficulty with designing NPCs to be handled by a group, an optimized group, and just making it a little bit more free-flowing, a little bit more open, the way that EverQuest did. I think seeing it done in Pantheon has really made me reconsider my own positions on this, and I'm glad that they are making this change, even if I railed against this change for a long time. I'm happy to eat crow when I'm wrong, and I feel definitely like I was wrong in supporting the elite NPC and solo NPC thing. But those are my ideas of what the game is missing right now, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say. My name is Redbeard Flynn. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day, and I will see you all soon.